All right. Welcome everybody again to the Thursday edition of 5G Into the Abyss, the reading series where we open up whoever's virtual window and step out onto the balcony, not just the window. There should be a balcony before you step out, a virtual one. And read the literature of writers who seem to be in dialogue with the abyss, whatever that abyss tends to be, but it is certainly ubiquitous in a line of writers that are inspiring this reading series, and something that is actually a point of reaction for dialogue that leads to great inspiration and thoughts that are reflective to help us navigate times of uncertainty, which some may argue are the only times that are possible to live. Anything certain is just a false grasping at comfort in order to let life pass a little easier, but then it passes so quickly that it's kind of nice to be in a little bit of conversation with things that cause us friction. So today I am going to continue down the path of reading a little bit of fiction. I started reading more literary criticism and commentary and some philosophy, and now I am sitting in a time of fiction, and we'll come back to some political philosophy tomorrow, I think. But today it is my pleasure to introduce you, if you don't know, to the book Knowledge of Hell by the Portuguese writer António Lobo Antunes. Today I'm going to read chapter 4 from Knowledge of Hell. It's translated from the Portuguese by Clifford E. Landers, and the publishing house is the Dalkey Archive Press. And again, the writer, António Lobo Antunes, Knowledge of Hell, Chapter 4. I discovered that loneliness, he said aloud to himself in the empty car en route to the mountains, is a child's gun in a plastic bag in the hand of a frightened woman. The afternoon now had the cloudy yellow color of the deceased, the melancholy yellow of the iodine in old portraits, the dirty yellow of the coffin against a tree trunk or a wall, the rusty yellow of limping dogs on the beach, running in packs beside the sea in the September twilight, under the immense silent sky where in the distance can be divined the equinox migrations of ducks. Gaunt, tragic plants rose to the fat, convex, almost violaceous cheeks of the clouds, multiple frenetic maestro's hands immobilized in the midst of a whirling waltz, and from time to time, on the edge of the road, tools and highway equipment dissolved in the sparse grass into the soft odor of the dead. Everything in the Algarve is feeble and gentle, he thought. Even the waves that fold onto themselves like successive eyelids rendered transparent by anemia, even the soapstone faces of the peasants in whose veins runs a secret, mysterious wind, even the quickly aging mornings that immediately turn heavy, hanging like fruit from the branches of the sky by thick incandescent pendulums of sunlight. No birds were to be seen because there are no birds in the mountains. Only the tools abandoned on the banks by highway workers and the ochre soil that seems to croak, breathing slowly like an enormous frog. Neither birds nor people were to be seen. The highway resembled a scar, a fold, a wrinkle in the skin, and on both sides of the horizon, too near, fogged the windows of the car, the square mirror, our very eyes, with its dense animal breath. No landscape seemed so menacing beneath its harmless appearance of theatrical scenery, and he imagined that if they hoisted the cardboard hills with pulleys behind the boxwoods, the hillocks, the sluggish, calming palpitation of the earth, he would find restive and agitated darkness, such as dwells in the round pupils of the eyes of children, hidden in the false complicity of a smile. Everything in the Algarve, he thought, reminds me of moonscapes, the entrapped algae, the quietness of naps in the summer, when only the apples on the sideboard remain awake and alive in their porcelain bowls, roused by the red shadow of the light, and it's not impossible for a school of fishes to suddenly cross the asphalt, wiggling the lilac eyelashes of their tails in tiny spasms, or for the 1,000 arms of an octopus to drift among the bushes, uncoiled in a woman's languid goodbye. Like in the emergency room of Miguel Bombarda Hospital, where the faces wrinkle and the silhouettes float by, staggering, leaning against the faded green walls, old alcoholics with trembling fingers like compass needles, drugged men with convulsed eyes like the heavens during a storm, old ladies in whom a discreet and incommensurate sadness concentrates in the circumflex angles of the mouth, dragging under their nightgown painful menopauses. At dinner time, a long line of beggars approaches the frosted glass door of the emergency room, feigning imaginary insanities, weird illnesses, made up suicides in the hope of a bed or a plate of food to escape from the forced fast of the poor. They are the bums who circulate in the vicinity of the river near the warehouses at the docks and on the steps of the Alfama district, the neck of a bottle sticking out of their pockets so they can light up the night with a wick of booze, concave, unshaven icons, dreaming of vegetable soup in the garbage cans. They head for Miguel Bombarda Hospital through the dark trees of Campo de Santana, through the little narrow sidewalks that form a kind of wig of lanes around the bald walls of the asylum, through Rua Luciano Cordera that my adolescence still associates with heavy thighs spread on threadbare velvet, and pour into the emergency room the supplicant sad gaze of dogs, barking at the doormat their humble hunger. But loneliness, he said aloud to himself in the empty car, en route to the mountains, is a child's gun in a plastic bag in the hand of a frightened woman standing before me at the other end of the table, escorted by an exhausted fireman. I slept in a bedroom as impersonal as a mess hall, whose sheets exuded the acrid odor of a grave, with a water bottle just like those in provincial boarding houses, and a telephone that from time to time weeps a baby's distressed moans. Close to 1,000 people were snoring in unison around me in a slow tidal movement, and I felt as if I were floating on the surface of the sound, stretched out in the sheets like the corpses of seamen that slide into the water enveloped in a canvas shroud and slowly sink beneath the waves like a strange, rigid cylinder of lead. When they called me into the emergency room, I would enter an unreal grotto in which steps multiply and voices echo, shatter, reduced to meaningless fragments without vowels under the neon of bulbs that conferred upon the white of the smocks a glaucous tone, almost incandescent, of whitewashed surfaces, moving about slowly, noiselessly, just as the houses in the Algarve move away behind us, staring at us with the square blind eyes of their windows. Policemen, firemen, the Republican Guard, families wait on worn benches, fearfully whispering church monosyllables. A dense night of crepe, the pre-dawn night, compact, opaque, almost solid, the night of insomnia or influenza, which neither breathes nor lives, and yet shivers from indecipherable frights, the way floors quiver in silence or flowers grow gigantic, impatiently. In the darkness, extending toward us, the carnivorous digits of their leaves pushes against the porch, its soft, weary breath. I sit at the desk, sticky from sleep, with the baby's cries of the telephone in the distance vibrating in my ears like some faraway but still present pain numbed by a pill, and grope for the ashtray awkwardly with the fingers with which I look for the water bottle if I awaken, in order to find it in my hand, the hard, smooth contact of glass, and through it the calming presence of familiar objects, and meet the gaze of the woman standing before me, clutching to her chest the plastic bag like someone slowly rocking a sick child. And I understood that loneliness, he said in the empty car on his way to Lisbon, isn't the trace of lipstick revealed on a glass in the empty office lit by blinds, or coming out of a bar where we perhaps left hanging on a chair the snake skin of fake happiness intended to disguise anxiety and fear. Loneliness is the people standing before me, and their gestures of wounded birds, their damp, gentle gestures that seem to drag themselves like dying animals in search of impossible help. When I tried to show you the hospital, Joanna, you refused with the stubborn, rock-like, unmovable firmness of children to pass through the gate. The sycamores glistened in the sun. The asylum offered the serene image of a neutral and friendly large house, free of ghosts, the August brightness lightly shaded the tulle face of the dust of summer, which rounds off corners and reduces angles, turning them diffuse like observers behind the curtain in a house, reducing them to the vague contours of cheekbones. From nearby streets came a happy smell, a sound of life, the jubilant blue reverberations of tiles, and I thought to myself, I'll show you the dressing room, the interiors of the dressing room, the enormous marble bathtub lying like a dead rhinoceros. I'll visit the vegetable garden with you, and we'll walk hand in hand through the sea of greens, becoming smaller and smaller and happier like the end of films until we dissolve gloriously into the horizon of houses on Gomez Frere. I'll introduce you to my friends, the orderlies, my daughter, and hear the laughter of your shyness that wraps around my legs in distressed embarrassment. You refused to go into the hospital, your eyes full of tears and your arms clutching my waist like some fragile, tenacious animal, your hair a skein of light-colored curls against my belly, and I suddenly remembered the well-kempt and servile little man who sold tin plates, tin vases, tin basins in the lobby of the asylum, and who always greeted me with the respectful bows of a music, bending at the waist like a folding rule. He was a bald guy in glasses, dignified and serious, an old patient whose lenses sparkled with the acid reflections of a teacher who asked me one day in the slow, cautious, vaguely ironic voice of a schoolmaster, an explainer, a disillusioned lecturer, if I hadn't noticed that in the asylum there were neither children nor animals, and that children and animals avoided the asylum the way they avoid death, impelled by some mysterious dread, the denial of agony, of putrefaction, of the morbid and funereal feelings of those inhabiting it. I listened to the little man speak as he circulated in his pointed patent leather shoes amid his vulgar tinware, amid his pretentious, ornate, useless, vulgar tinware. And I added that not even birds perched in the trees in the courtyard, as devoid of wings as the eyelids of albinos with their lashes ruffled by the hollow summer wind. Not even sparrows, the guy said, want anything to do with the asylum. You can see that. Not sparrows or pigeons or blackbirds, none of the kind. Then confidentially nudging. We're under the ground, you know. This here is the purgatory of the living, full of burning people. When there aren't any birds, I said, it's as if there wasn't enough air, as if we're suffocating in air belly up like pink-mouthed fishes in the green foam of aquariums. The little man bent down to adjust the horrible tin tray with the national seal at its center, which an elderly lady was contemplating, absorbed, and poked me in the chest with a finger as hard and stiff as a piece of fishing pole. A strange smile twisted in his mouth into swirls of saliva. Maybe one of us will learn to fly, doctor. Maybe one of us will perch in the sycamores in the courtyard. And he set out running, limping over the tiles in the lobby, shaking the tin sleeves of his jacket and crying, cheep, 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 in sharp, bat-like caws. However, the girl standing before me didn't fly. I was sitting at my desk, surrounded by my papers, my pen suspended over the file card, white for men, blue for women, different colors like baby clothes. Looking at her, and the fireman pallid from fatigue who accompanied her, dark, translucent circles under the eyes from the lack of sleep, under the high lunar lamp on the ceiling that emitted a melancholy phosphorescence, and with difficulty I freed myself from my own darkness, from my own ghosts, to listen to them. They came from Serpa to Faro, and from Faro to Lisbon, driven away from hospital to hospital by the impatience of doctors. We don't have beds, we don't have specialists, we don't have resources, melting in the heat of an old ambulance whose engine coughed like a faltering kitchen appliance constantly on the verge of irreversible coma. Steaming through the nostrils of the hood of the sluggish vapor of its final breaths. The girl lived by herself on a deserted hillside, 2 or 3 haylofts in room that smelled of goat dejecta and rotten bones in the rain, and one day she suddenly appeared in the village and squatted in front of the guard post on a kind of wall in front of the guard post, talking to angels. Little by little, the corporal of the squadron the parish administrator, the priest, a group of stupefied peasants, the blind man with menacing opaque glasses like slate discs that no chalk illuminated, the poor circus acrobats who set up their tent in the square gathered around her, amazed and apprehensive, to listen to her question the archangel Gabriel with intriguing familiarity that sprouted in the prior, the mushrooms of envy. The veterinarian, quickly summoned, interrupted the difficult birth of a mare, groaning softly in her resigned suffering to alert the lunatic's doctor from Faro, who should be able to understand the celestial hosts and invisible creatures. But the doctor from Faro, impatient with angels, sent the girl with the plastic bag to Lisbon, along with a letter authenticated by a rubber stamp and an indistinct signature. During the journey, the woman, installed beside the fireman driving the ancient ambulance, shaking like tractor operators perched on their iron seats, answered the seraphims' questions in the half-Latin, half-Russian language that surely must be used in the frozen spaces of the stars. And now there she was, standing in front of me, looking at the walls with strange quartz eyes, waving silently to the floating gaseous creatures whom we couldn't see in the office's glare of spectral insomnia. The fireman had plopped his aching body down on the sofa and was looking through his pockets for the oxygen of a cigarette. At the other end of the corridor, an alcoholic tied to his bed howled ceaselessly like a lighthouse in the fog, confused roars that distance blurred and muffled. In the intervals between his bellows, I seemed to hear very close to my ears the rustling murmur of feathers. The nurse pushed aside an inopportune quill. Outside, the trees at night were beginning to coo like doves, as if each leaf were a dove calling to us. And, in an irritated tone, bothered by the odor of the thickening incense, sulfurous and sweet, in the emergency room, asked me, "Why not give her an injection against angels? You must have learned to kill angels at the university. The autopsy cadavers are deceased angels, angels who allow themselves to be cut apart without a word of protest." "Maybe call a bishop," suggested the custodian, checking the file cabinet drawer so no seraphim could hide among the papers. "Bishops know all about angels and devils, as long as they dress in red, like souls in hell." The girl, immobile, standing very straight, clutching to her chest the plastic bag, allowed the angels to alight on her shoulders, in her hair, on her arms, like birds on statues in parks, perched on bronze heroes like clothes on hangers. If I didn't act quickly, the asylum would be transformed into a celestial aviary, replete with the rustle of tunics and sidereal dronings, and dozens of winged men who would invade the emergency room, breathing light laughter on the backs of our necks like the bubbles from gills that dissolve in green bursts of moss. "Why not give her an injection against angels?" insisted the orderly. "There's got to be an injection against angels, like there's rat poison, roach powder, or treatment for phylloxera. Angels are easier to kill than phylloxera." And for an instant, he imagined, as he wrote some prescription or other on a file card, angels in agony on the floor, sweaty and pale, calling out to him with the smoked glass pupils of the moribund, which little by little shed expression and color until they resemble hollow crystals without reflections, identical to the hard plastic eyes of stuffed animals. He imagined the city's garbage trucks loaded at night with biblical astronauts with porous eagle bones and divers' fins, piled on one another in the attitude of castaways. He imagined a young cherub hanging from a gutter, lilac ankles rubbing against the porch's parapets. Imagined his own guardian angel lying at his feet like a shadow, arms spread, a bloody remnant of the Milky Way evaporating from the corner of his lips. The firemen who had remained with him in the office from the injection room could be heard like a commotion. From the injection room could be heard like commotion in a henhouse, panicked cackles, breaking eggs, the custodian's voice railing against the archangels, had meanwhile fallen asleep on the sofa like a child in the backseat of a car. And the flickering light of the bulb in the ceiling conferred on their silhouettes, motionless till then, the mobility of gravel silently colliding with itself, pebbles hurling themselves at one another, crumbling, propelled perhaps by the thrashing of the angel's agony. That night, the night rested against the window panes a tree branch that fluttered like an aspergillum. And the patient sleep hummed the way empty houses hum if we but listened to them. merging with the throbbing of our temples, the throbbing of the veins in our hands, our bellies, our temples. When lying down, we feel our bodies shrink into the sheets until they assume the size of useless, anguished dust. I felt the urge to stretch out on the floor like a dog, to rest my face against the boards, as cool as a clean pillowcase, until the dead cherubim were swept from the hospital. The drunk who went on screaming from somewhere, now unlocatable to me, to the left, to the right, to the floor upstairs in the exact center of my stomach, the laughter of the unkempt, horrible women from the first ward advancing in a halting duck-like march. I wished I could be far away from the profound interior misery of people, from their frail fragility and their fear. Wished I could sleep like the fireman, asleep without childish remorse, and brush my teeth in the morning in a pink plastic cup with Mickey Mouse printed on it, without the promise of hell awaiting me. I dragged my arms along the desk and rested my chin on the rectangular blotter like an old terrier on a doormat. A sick terrier with sad, red, timid eyes. I was falling asleep. I was surely falling asleep in the office where the light vibrated like a trapped wing, milky and smooth, burning under our skin in a kind of slow combustion. I would add my sleep to the hundreds of poor sleeps accumulating in the decrepit building, approaching and retreating in a grave tidal purring, in a grave tidal purring. It was 3 a.m., and I was starting to gently absent myself from myself as gas slowly escapes from a balloon, as water flees between the fingers that hold it. The nurse's footsteps approached in the corridor outside, rapid and hard, as if nails of pain were being driven into my weariness, stabbing nails of pain into my weariness. They penetrated into the office, angrily percussing my forehead, stopped next to my chair with a whisper of starched uniforms, identical to the gust of wind in July through the lemon tree in the yard. You want to see what she's carrying in the bag? And with the easy grace of an illusionist, she took out a Bakelite pistol and a rusty hammer. The imbecile of a custodian appeared in the doorframe as unexpected as a street fair marionette popping out of his canvas hole. When you live alone in the hills, a woman has to defend herself, doesn't she? Defend herself from bums and dogs, defend herself from the ghosts full of teeth, from the rich. Bang, 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 said the nurse, pointing the toy gun at the light fixture in the ceiling. Bang, 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 echoed the custodian, gripping his esophagus with both hands, as if in a gangster film, staggering on the linoleum, writhing in pain, his guts riddled with imaginary lead slugs. In the empty car en route to Santana, the sides of the mountain range, carved almost upright, seemed to him like cloudy mirrors into which the afternoon pressed its fat, yellowish face, surrounded by motionless ringlets of bushes. A hare dashed across the asphalt and disappeared into the bright shadow of a thicket. The landscape was beginning to take on the texture of the craft paper in church nativity scenes, lit by the large bluish dripping candle of the sun. A torn bullfight poster flapped like an arm from a piece of wall that the heat was dissolving, and I thought loneliness is the bitterness of dignity, thought women's loneliness is the most melancholy form of nobility, thought about the final years of my grandmother's lives, sitting in the living room among portraits of dead military men waiting for death like Eskimos on ice floes. Thought about the agony of the pigeon in Tomar, alone on the roof facing the mess hall, which every afternoon I sat at the table in the bedroom to write the long novel that I would never publish, that I will never publish and on which all my books feed. I seemed thinner, more wrinkled, more exhausted, chilled by the breath of June and by fever. I thought I called the head servant, showed him the pigeon and asked, "Do something about that animal." And that the man leaned out the window, examined the bird, turned to me and said, "It's dead. If you want, I can sweep it down with a broom." I thought about the man's indifference and the indifference of the other pigeons that went on flying in a flock around the station, above the willows and the mulberry trees in the square, now white, now dark, like the two faces of playing cards. Thought, soon at night, the ghost of the pigeon will keep me from sleeping by sinking its anguished claws into my neck. Thought about the loneliness of people and pigeons and about the hammers and that frightened no one. Thought about the woman from Serpa, filled with gentleness and hunger and fear, threatening with her Bakelite pistol the derision of bums. I thought about the young girl from Serpa surrounded by the inaudible sighs of dead angels, benumbed in a hospital bed amid the drunkard's horrible cries and the patients who meandered in the dark like dazed automatons. The nurse handed the gun back to me and said, bang, bang, bang. And I fell into a soft mound of feathers, dragging with me a pile of file cards that danced in the air until they covered my body the way leaves in the park in autumn cover the carcasses of dogs. It's going to start getting dark, I thought. It's going to start getting dark in an hour or two. The afternoon is going to turn as delicate and fine as tissue paper. The smell of jasmine will rise from the earth, insistent and sickening like the flowers of the dead. The darkness grows from the pores of the ground, first lilac, then reddish, deep blue afterward, populated by insects, murmurs, exclamations, small tears. The trees shake without changing position, like brooding hens, while the branches take on the extraordinary sharpness of twilight engraved on the soft waxen plaque of the sky. Nothing yet heralds the night, but a light veil, a tenuous web of shadow separates us from things, establishes between us and them the mysterious distance of darkness, where clocks tick to the panting rhythm of the blood. Night, he thought, is the cardiac anguish of alarm clocks, the unfindable switch of the lamp that the hand gropes for blindly and never locates, the glass of water on the nightstand that seems to contain a slice of the moon and all the rivers of the dark, those that are born in the thighs of women to flow through the sheet toward our arched bodies, tense with the slow rage of desire. It's going to start getting dark, he thought. And as it always does when night falls, an undefined melancholy, a diffuse restiveness, a vague tremor in the bones causes to vibrate in me. Before the orange, the gray, the faded ochre of sunset, a wind with neither origin nor destination, prolonged like a moan or sigh that precedes the oblique flight of owls hidden in tree trunks like gaunt, cruel specters. To the right of the highway, in a hollow of packed dirt, were the road workers' enormous kettles of asphalt, strips of wood, traffic signs on tripods, rollers and shovels were stored. A few vans were parked in the front of one of those types of restaurants sometimes found in deserted areas of the provinces, displaying wicker or painted metal tables under a thatched roof. Half a dozen tiny speckled chickens trotted austerely in the dust with the jerky motions of husbands. A goat tied by a piece of rope bobbed sadly its withered beard of an unpublished poet, apathetically grazing in a corner of the cafe on mimeographed grass from magazines. He stopped next to the car to a tall tractor, similar to the throne of a tennis referee, smelling the manure and the oil, and got out to have a beer in the lonely mountain restaurant, against whose counter leaned the soft, sweaty shoulders of the truck drivers, hanging from their necks like padded jackets on a nail. The horizon was pleated with clouds like a folded accordion. A flock of hoopos glided diagonally on the other side of the roof in the direction of a yellow-gray thicket, waddling the farewell of their wings in a quick tinkling of glasses. My muscles, tight from the journey, reluctantly uncoiled with the slowness of worms observed by the antiquarian eyes of the goat, which was masticating the chewing gum of an unfinished Alexandrine. And he seated himself near the window, chin in hand, looking at but not seeing the sooty shoulders of the highway. Behind him, a monotonous whisper of voices rose and fell in a dolorous sound, the sound of the foam from waves in the siphon of the rocks, similar to that of the female patients in the Marias Club in the 5th Women's Ward of Miguel Bombarda Hospital before the doctor's arrival. The 5th Ward, on the top floor of the asylum, accessed by way of an enormous elevator sobbing from floor to floor its sharp shrieks of panic, was, when established, a sad purgatory that the psychiatrist made a futile effort to enliven by covering the walls with mirrors that multiplied and reflected the dusky shapes of the patients, their miserable condition as prisoners. They were forbidden to go out alone, forbidden to take a walk, forbidden any contact with men, because we don't want the responsibility, because we don't want any confusion, we don't want any problems, we don't want protests from families. So the only amusements allowed consisted of taking their medication, of doing vague, useless sewing and inattending, piled in the dining room in chairs as precarious as baby teeth, the club meetings one morning a week, run by technicians imbued with the unctuous goodwill of Christian jailers. The doctor would arrive at 11, clinically look at the river's tongue through the locked porches, A river also imprisoned by the frame, blue and flat like long vacations, commune their ritual coffee in their lay confessionals, separated by narrow wooden dividers, increase or decrease dosages according to the patient's frenzy, and finally go in a group to the dining room, dispensing to all sides the smiles of healers. Each smile shouted, "I'm sane and you're crazy, but if you behave, maybe I can do something for you. Maybe make you as normal as us, as normal as us, as normal as us. 3 pills at breakfast, 3 pills at lunch, 3 pills at dinner." The sick women calmed down silently, the interns disseminated strategically among the public. Make believe for a while that we're all equals. The assistant installed himself facing the audience with the kindly indulgence of a minister at a provincial soiree, crossed his legs and between his cuff and sock shone a piece of hairy flesh identical to the gelatin of octopuses, to the gelatin of the thick marine flora of Sesimbra. And always at that moment, at that exact instant when the session began, I felt like barking and leaping up to bite that round chunk of shin, the shin of power that with patient pendulum-like serenity swung the patent leather shoe. "The minutes," requested the leg with the inflection of a cannon. A nightshirt rose in the rear in the style of an elementary school version of Ballad of the Snow, read slowly and poorly from a book with a waterproof cover like the ones housewives use to keep accounts. Fragments of meaningless sentences fluttered randomly into the saturated air, seeking in vain some kind of escape. There was no escape. The nurse, her arms crossed, stood guard at the door, and he thought as he looked at his colleagues, the dream of guys like these, is to be psychiatrists by divine prerogative, to be right by papal infallibility, to impose their pomposity and melancholy order on the disorder of others, to themselves determined, with marks on a chalkboard, the volatile limits of suffering and joy. If I bite the presiding shin, barking out my raging indignation on all fours, the canon will limit himself to laying a friendly hand on my shoulder and suggesting, "You're not well. Why don't you go into analysis?" with the amicable comprehension of a hangman. The cotton nightshirt suddenly fell silent in mid-syllable, and the leg asked, "Does anyone wish to comment on the minutes?" scratching his other ankle with a polished shoe. Angola, he thought in the mountain restaurant over a warm beer, feeling the almost imperceptible presence of darkness in the still intact daylight. Darkness that could be discerned in the shadowy speckles of the day like a face in the mirror. I almost missed the war because at least in war, things are simple. You're trying not to die, trying to endure, and we find ourselves so occupied with that enormous, desperate, tragic task that we have no time for perversity and dirty tricks. I would go into the company's storeroom. The eucalyptuses were sobbing softly outside, far above our heads, in the dull fog of the drizzle, observe the beers in their wooden crates and say aloud, "I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to go there," tripping over the sacks of supplies in my enormous rubber boots, crushing potatoes, onions, soft things, a dog who moved aside, protesting quietly. The supply corporal jumped up from his hammock between the coffins, sat up, rubbing his eczema-encrusted eyelids, and recounted in the barracks that a ghost that looked like the doctor was wandering among the vegetables and the caskets, the soda bottles and the packs of cigarettes, murmuring the absurd speeches of ghosts. Angola, he thought in the mountain restaurant over a warm beer that tasted like snail slime and bath foam. Perhaps the war goes on in a different form inside us. Perhaps I am still occupied with the enormous, desperate, tragic task of enduring without protest, without rebellion, of enduring timidly like the patients of the 5th Ward at Miguel Bombarda Hospital, looking at the psychiatrist in a strange mixture of hope and terror. Those who behave, my dears, have the right to weekends at home. Those who don't behave get a quick punishment of injections, and sleeps surrounded by absolute darkness, a blackness as total as that of the nights of the blind, whose eyes resemble dead birds lying in cages of their lashes. If no one wishes to comment on the minutes, declared the leg, we'll move on to the information phase. A doctor with a beard out of colloquial lettres and artis, who possessed the composure of the stupid, that species of imbecilic restraint that masquerades as good sense, raised his nicotine-stained index finger and announced the important purchase thanks to the club dues, the sweeping gesture of a bullfighter, of a new coffee machine for the members' use. As the psychiatrists were almost the only ones with money, its general utility was obvious, and he thought of the announcement by the officer responsible for the delivery of mail: "The bottles of whiskey are intended exclusively for officers. The soldiers drink orangeade, wine on Sundays, and that's all," he thought. "When I was living at home with my parents, coffee was something for adults. You earned the right to coffee when you got your degree. After you graduate, you drink coffee and you smoke." The river panted next to the windows like a winded horse. Its mane floated against the tiles of the house in the manner of the oakum beads of the prophets, and a hollow, neutral silence, the silence of death, the silence of empty bedrooms and of corridors in the darkness of death, surrounded the psychiatrist, suffocated the psychiatrist the way the gardener's fingers strangled sparrows in the yard, and I saw the pink beaks open and close in asthmatic distress. The La Fontaine profile of the occupational therapist, straight from the oval portraits of the Pleiades, announced in the tone of a fable that the Maria's next visit to the zoo, to the napless animals of the zoo sorrowfully mooing behind the wire nets, staring at people with gentle expressions full of lonesome and shame, which the sycamores concealed like wrinkles. "Any further information?" asked the leg still swinging, and he imagined the patients in a closed circle, shepherded by the nurses, trotting from cage to cage with total indifference. Only the old women who couldn't get out of bed remained in the asylum, poking their gray noses toward the ceiling, sunk in the round cheeks of the pillowcases. Only the old women who gave up the mattresses for the funeral homes on bumpy stretchers wrapped in the yellowish stains of the sheets. At Santa Maria, he recalled, in surgery and medicine, there were individual rooms for the terminal cases so that the anguish and sighing of the moribund wouldn't disquiet the other patients, inflict upon them the horrid spectacle of agony when a bed was wheeled into the corridor. The patients would spy in panic to see which neighbor was leaving, scrutinizing his thin face, almost of plaster, the deep, soft, repugnant wrinkles of death. And the dying person moaned and protested greatly, crying, imploring them to let him stay in the ward, because staying in the ward meant, despite everything, a delay of sentence, the certainty of a few more hours of life. The bed would disappear, squeaking down the corridor. A new patient would fill the vacant spot, and the intruder would be looked at askance as if he were to blame, as if he were truly to blame, as if it had been he who wheeled away the bed down the corridor en route to the final bedroom. I had finished the course weeks earlier, knew nothing of the suffering of men, the miserable, poignant, unjust suffering of mankind, and stood in the middle of the room, rolling the rubber tube of the stethoscope in my hands, angry at my useless young science, my impotence and my fright, stood in the middle of the room with its large windows beyond which Lisbon spun in the light, in the uneven slowness of a carousel, causing its ugly, complicated monuments to turn like wooden giraffes. The patients at Miguel Bombarda Hospital, he thought, looking around at the multitude of nightshirts sitting wordlessly in their formica chairs, didn't sob, didn't protest, didn't cry. They are gray cadavers, poor castrated cadavers that breathed lightly, doped with tranquilizers, bloated from pills and capsules, moving with the sluggish motion of algae from compartment to compartment, dragging their slippers on the boards, concave from where of the floor. As a result of the lack of water, the flushing mechanisms don't work. The dejecta accumulates in toilets, the urine putrefies, foaming in the urinals, and an unbearable stench from the latrine, a faceless stench, unpleasant and foul, wafts through the offices without alighting on anything, identical to a bird without compass, meek and desperate. The patients of the club must smell the odor, be bothered by the odor the way mules are bothered by the smell of blood, agitated on the inside by disgust, but with nothing showing in their immobile features, absolutely still, as unmoving as those of landscapes, of photographs of summer sunsets, nothing showing in their ever horizontal features, decomposing slightly in the formica chairs. No information, the leg repeated with beatific insistence. The smell came and went in the room, but the psychiatrist bore courageously, without blinking, without change of expression, the smell of others, the insanity of others, the despair, the anxiety, the agony, the fear of others. "I wish to inform you that you're crazy," I feel like shouting. I feel I wish to inform that all this meeting, this asylum, this scientific shit is the final proof of your stupidity, your uselessness, your insanity. I wish to inform you that I'm going crazy along with you, and I want you to take me away from here before I turn into one more cotton nightshirt full of pills wandering around the cages at the zoo on Sunday mornings. At that moment, before I could open my mouth, a patient stood up, pointed to the leg, and exclaimed ecstatically, "You, doctor, are the Holy Father." The doctor smiled at her with tenebrous gentleness. "The Holy Father. You, doctor, are the Holy Father," repeated the patient, "and the other doctors, civilian governors." The doctor's mouth opened in immense satisfaction. "This case is an excellent teaching tool, an excellent teaching tool. Don't change her therapy and keep her for my class." Once a week, the students would enter the asylum as if in a leper's hospice, keeping as far as possible from us, as if by touching us, they ran the risk of catching some abominable disease, of losing their minds, of winding up in the jacket with the ridiculous tin medals. They were afraid the doors would be locked on them, that they would be put into regulation pajamas and never again be allowed outside to go into the apparently free, pale-colored city, to the city that seemed to convalesce in the dull glass of morning, in which the Tagus and the sky merged like two faces staring at each other at close range. They were young men and women with skin still marked by the acne scars of adolescence, those pinkish bubbles that come to the surface of smiles and burst in the air like fragile little spears of happiness. Young men and women whom for now disenchantment and cynicism had not had time to metamorphose into wise, composed, acrimonious, and incredulous beings, had not had time to metamorphose into executioners. Because we're executioners, he thought in the mountain restaurant, watching the afternoon gradually fade into the spare, narrow landscape of the Algarve interior, where the sea doesn't penetrate and an aridness of cartilage inhabits the people and the land. We are, in fact, executioners of cadavers, executioners of these inert, soft cadavers, of these silent cadavers, abstract, defenseless, motionless in their rooms with the lightness of statues. We're executioners, he wanted to shout to the club, ignorant and perverse executioners mired in the rotten odor of stagnant piss and shit, talking about the coffee makers, trips to the zoo, and other similarly shitty entertainments. We're executioners, and when we go home, we exhale in the vestibule between the coat hanger and the console, annihilated odors of Marias, because when we hang up our raincoats, it's a bit of ourselves we hang, our bodies withered like the partridges in still lives, pointing the beaks of our lips toward the floorboards. As there's no further information to convey, decreed the leg, we'll move along to the order of the day. If my colleagues would be so kind, a female psychiatrist of the Norman Mare type, with a large trunk, large limbs, a large, heavy, ridiculous horse-like chin, chewing at a bubblegum mouthpiece, dissertated at length, consulting memorandums and notes about the mirrors that lined the living room, and in which, whatever our position, we were malignantly confronted with multiple images of ourselves, like at the tailor's when he marks us with chalk, pads our shoulders, the rough sketch of the wings we don't possess. That stubborn persecution of oneself, of one's eyes endlessly, anxiously searching for approval or a smile, that constant presence of the profile that he inhabited and poorly understood, poorly commanded, whose reactions, tastes, impulses he poorly perceived, produced him in a kind of torture, a vertigo of nausea, as if the floor were oscillating from side to side, the hesitant rocking of a boat, forcing upon him a difficult balance among the restless furniture. The doctors had decided that the mirrors returned the patients to a much needed contact with external reality, so they surrounded them with an abracadabra gallery of reflections, of sparkles, of vertical metallic brilliance, on whose surface gestures acquired the odd textures of ballet, of some strange immaterial dance, of serpentine farewells, of spirals of smoke that dissolved and thickened in the rhythmless rhythm of a doleful breeze. The Norman Mare was laying into a prolix report on the therapeutic effects of the singular invention, swearing that if they flooded the asylum, the city, the country, the entire universe with hundreds of thousands of millions of mirrors, mental illness would be soon as much of a thing of the past as collar stretchers, and people free of homosexuality, fetishes, schizophrenia, Oedipus complexes, and depression would live for 200 years in a dazed paradisiacal happiness like mongoloids and hospital administrators. The patients listened to the long discourse in silence, coughing from time to time the stifled maladies of mummies. Rivers and sky came together now mutually in the manner of closing lips, and the shadow of the clouds glided lightly over the boats like a bunch of fingers through the scales on a piano. Would my colleagues please make a clean copy of that as soon as possible, Legg decided solemnly, to be presented to the proper authorities. To the Ministry of Social Affairs, suggested a psychiatrist wearing sneakers like some lucid beggar who bobbed in his chair with enthusiasm at the marvelous prospect of a reflecting planet. To Public Works, timidly added La Fontaine in the inviting tone with which the fox must have addressed the crow with the cheese. If we started with the facade of the hospital, maybe it wouldn't even be necessary to admit the sick people. They would come to their senses at the entrance to the gate and automatically be cured. The Norman mayor raised her fist in agitation. Caution is called for. An American study was published a short time ago about the dangers of an excess of mirrors. There are even those who try to commit suicide by spreading their arms and throwing themselves onto their image. Sanford and his co-authors, observed the colloquial, irritated at the mayor's success, described the case of an insurance agent who slashed his wrist with a piece of glass that reflected his face. It was as if one part of him were cruelly assassinating the other half. In the 20th century, commented an ugly female psychologist covered by some Mexican singer's poncho, Luis Alberto de Panera, he laughed inwardly, beneath which must crawl multiple arachnid appendages with gnawed nails. In the 20th century, narcissists find themselves uncomfortable in prosaic professions. Down with the company gas, bellowed a voice from somewhere in the back of the room. It's important, opined the Legg, to study the percentage of surface that will remain uncovered. 24.3%, according to the Rabendorf, Hages, and Mech, clarified the mayor. The French, countered the lucid beggar, fanning himself with Reich's sexual revolution, argue 23.4. The Swiss school of Professor Heinemann replaced the mirrors with coated yellow plastic, explained an undefined creature who, for 6 years in Geneva, revealed in French the sorrows of early childhood to a silent and impenetrable psychoanalyst who probably already felt dead after the 5th or 6th session and who smelled mildly bad in his wing chair. Which is cheaper? Asked a nurse whose practical sense of life and the rise in the price of grouper kept her close to the immediate realities. That type of decision is beyond our scope, replied the Legg in a proud transport of scientific humility. Our task is limited to composing a memorandum to the proper authorities. A respectful silence fell, and at that moment the door opened and an old fat maid wearing a wig and an apron around her hips came in, carrying a tray of coffee cups which clinked on the saucers like the crystal drops of chandeliers. The black liquid gave off oily sparkles of tar. The white convex china of the cups had the glaucous and morbid sheen of eyes with cataracts. The elderly maid, her wig rigidly atop her head like a helmet of hair, placed before the Legg a cracked plastic sugar bowl, and smiling to right and left with papal urbanity, he spooned the sugar into the doctor's cups with the stately gestures with which priests cast incense from censers, murmuring exorcisms in Latin from the corners of their mouths. The head nurse shooed the patients toward the mirror room as if she had an invisible rod in her hands, and the nightshirts staggered like geese down the corridor, puffing their cotton belly feathers in a pandemonium of quacking that grew in volume, deformed, divided, pulverized into the glass surfaces in a raucous tempest of sound. If one face in the mirror becomes strange, indifferent, menacing, left-handed, disturbing, the echo of a sound, of several sounds, of many sounds, requires the aspect of an unbearable sight, a deafening nightmare, a landscape of grotesque moans that envelops us until it submerges us in its dance of clamorous shadows. The occupational therapist began describing pieces of wrapping paper to make grocery bags, and the members of the club sitting in a circle folded the grayish light cardboard in slow, inattentive creases, looking at themselves in the mirrors with ineffable terror. There were 40 or 50 women whose psychiatric treatments had reduced to indifferent animals with hollow mouths, hollow eyes, hollow chests, vegetating in that extended summer morning of flashes of blue lightning. Smoke from the other shore resembled bloodied rags clinging to the wrinkled plaster wall of the sky, raised vertically before us to prevent the flight of the gulls. It imprisoned us in its white bell jar, spotted with clouds, cleft by fissures, by that mysterious complex of tiny pleats that rests like a web on the mysterious, alarming features of old pictures. The sky imprisoned us the way the mirrors imprisoned the patients, and transformed us as well into mournful, sad creatures, talking to one another over cups of coffee and smooth and imbecilic horse whinnies. We smelled like stuffed animals, Joanna. We smelled like doctors with the unmistakable aroma of doctors, which took me back to the PIDE jailers in Angola, repellent and filthy, furiously smoking cigarettes in the carbonized glare of morning. The leg asked me amiably, taking his cigarette holder from its case, "How are your daughters?" And I understood, staring at his tumescent porcine face, his fat fingers, the rubber smile unfolding on his cheeks like an accordion, a smile that squealed, off-key the asthma of a harmonium, staring at the doctors who, brandishing their coffee spoons, were discussing bitter dialogues of laundress, that we should attempt, like seagulls, to break through the sky of plaster that walled us in, smash the mirrors, reject the paper bags, and get out of there before they medicated us, measured our IQ, our powers of reasoning, our memory, will, emotions, and cataloged us, and finally labeled us and tossed us into the dark drawer of a ward, awaiting in terror the immense bat of night. The leg lit his cigarette with a silver lighter, blew the smoke through the napkin ring of his lips, and I remembered, mired in his dense courtesy, in his dangerous congeniality, how, when I wanted to show you the hospital, Joanna, you refused to go past the gate with the stubborn, rock-like, unmovable firmness of children. I remembered the sycamores that sparkled in the sun, and the asylum that presented the serene image of a harmless old house free of ghosts. I remembered the faces that the August brightness underlined with the dull dust of summer, turning them diffuse and vague like observers behind the curtain in a house, reducing them to the out-of-focus contours of cheekbones. The bags were piled in the mirror room, which the occupational therapist crossed in large strides, as ostentatiously resolute as a lion tamer, a tamer of unhappy somnambulant beasts that from time to time emit the insignificant catarrhal roar of a poodle. "I don't want to go into the hospital," my daughter said, the frightened curls of her hair crushed against my belly. "I don't want to go into the hospital because I'm afraid of the sick people." Through the open door, I saw gliding along the corridor the aluminum lunch pails, rocking on a kind of wheeled cart that a one-eyed custodian, as bent as a bow, was pushing like a recalcitrant plow. The aroma of the food, hot and humid, penetrated my nostrils with its wary sweetness. A rattling of silverware vibrated in the distance, an absurd familiar atmosphere, an agreeable torpor. A sleepy fatigue was beginning to invade me, to insinuate itself into my body in repose, when the guffaw of the Norman mare suddenly burst out behind me in a carnivorous, almost brutal explosion of jubilation. "I'm a lot more afraid of the psychiatrists," I answered. There you go. That was a chapter in Antonio Lobo Antunes' knowledge of hell. It's a fantastic read between a psychiatric hospital, time after the Portuguese War in Angola, and a man's vacillation between what he believes to be normal and sane and insane. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I will see you tomorrow.